How do males and females conduct antisocial behavior, conflict, and warfare? Well, males do it by pretty obvious means. We hit things and break them. We use pointy things and stab them. And we get together in formations and do it in a ballet we call war. That's how we put it to good use. We defend men against other men in order to maintain that ability to work in large numbers against other groups of men. We also can demonstrate that behavior as antisocial behavior by drinking, fighting, any disruption, violence, theft, crime. We know what male antisocial behavior is. So what's female antisocial behavior? Promiscuity, we call bitchiness, gossiping, rallying, shaming, moralizing, undermining, reputation destruction, two-facedness, double-crossing. It's all these things, these behaviors. What's happened, though, is that we've now made the world different enough that women can equally participate in economy and polity. We've studied all this history of male war and law and economics, whatever. But what have we studied about the female method of warfare? See, what happened in the Victorian era is we sort of sacralized women. But throughout history, women are thought of as largely evil creatures. Throughout history, women are thought of evil creatures precisely because they are. They gossip, rally, shame, undermine, and they create a lot of havoc. So if you look at our legal codes throughout history, the men are responsible for controlling their daughters and their wives. We had a very egalitarian law between men and women. Like if you got out of hand, they'd dig a hole for you to stand in, and they give a woman the club and you a club. This is meant to equalize your fighting capacity, to reduce it to a duel, and go ahead and whack the shit out of each other. Get it over with, but get it out. But it was done in public. But what do women do? They gossip and shame and rally and moralize and psychologize and undermine and fib and fabricate and magically think behind people's backs because they're trying to socially construct a deceit by which to war. We used to have those laws. It used to be that if you were a woman and you were engaged in shrilling, which is the legal term for what women do to undermine, gossiping was a crime. Shrilling was a crime, which we think of it as canceling. These were crimes because they were violations of the peace. Women can't even imagine they're evil intrinsically, but they are.
And they will never admit it,
even
if they figured it out.
Women's nature is intrinsically evil because it's based on their one weapon, seduction and rejection. So seduction is baiting you into a hazard at the lowest cost. So the woman's basic utility is, I can bait you with my intrinsic value and never fucking deliver because you're a stupid man and you'll keep giving me for nothing. In other words, she'll buy on options. What is gambling? What is all gambling? What is financialism? What is advertising? It's an extension of the female method of warfare by seduction without ever having to deliver by reciprocity. So they warfare by baiting into a hazard and undermining. It's their two directions. You see this in every aspect of life. I noticed it in consulting most often because I always found out that when any dysfunctional company I got into is because some group of women had figured out how to manipulate the stupid men. And they undermine each other. I mean, so women henpeck. Like they never give up and they destroy the enemy completely. Like men, we just fight till we're in a position, but women destroy each other. And they're trying to always scam. They're trying to get something for nothing. And then they can't tolerate the blame that's generated by it. So they have to resort to magical thinking. Because in order to be a woman, you have to have high neuroticism. But civilizations took this same thing. I'll start with the gypsies because they're the fun one, because everybody's okay with picking on gypsies. Their thing is they settle on petty crime. They specialize in petty crime. Now, what did the Mongols do? They took horses and moved very quickly with high crimes. What did the gypsies do? They took donkeys or wood carts and they slowly went through places committing petty crimes. You have to get rid of the Mongols because they disrupt the structure. So you've got to pay that cost. Do you get rid of the gypsies? Nobody actually gets rid of them because they're just a fucking annoyance. And besides, they supply prostitutes. They don't trip us from a minor moral variation into a necessity of suppression. Mm-hmm. Well, what do women do? Women do the same thing. They don't trip us from an annoyance that we have to tolerate. Some groups specialize in the female method of warfare. So there's Europeans, we'd specialize in the somewhere between the masculine and libertarian method of warfare. In other words, we specialize in war, and we do that because we have a libertarian basis in law. The Chinese specialize in state warfare. The Middle East specializes in undermining or raiding warfare, and the Jews specialize in the female method of warfare. But they live just like women do on the commons provided by other host civilizations. So the Jews have developed not only the female method of warfare into a cultural group evolutionary strategy, but they've developed into a system of warfare that they use within any population they go to, which is why they get in trouble all the time. And they justify it by the same means women justify it, by demonizing white men as a proxy for natural laws of nature. And so eventually we tolerate them until we've had enough, just like the Russian guy tolerates his wife slapping him until he's had enough. And so eventually they get slapped and they, like women, say they're not to blame. But do you think they know what they're doing? No. So anyway, the Jews were already predisposed to a certain behavior in the Middle East. They chose the female group strategy, which is what allowed a concentrated diasporic people, just like the gypsies, a concentrated diasporic people to profit by riding on the commons of others and then engaging in those oppressions that bait into hazard, like seduce people into hazard, which require externalizing all risk, then asymmetrically profiting from it. So what did they specialize? Alcohol on credit, slaving, money changing. And they said, well, we weren't allowed to own property. The reason you weren't allowed to own property is because you baited people into hazard with 300% interest, and we didn't want you seizing all their fucking property because then it doesn't get work. You privatize what the state needs as income. You were banned on property because you were getting it criminally. So what happened is we let the women into the franchise. We had a period of female worship. We had the Industrial Revolution, and then we let women into the franchise. Just as we created the war, it destroyed the civilization and our confidence in norms and traditions. Then we had Hitler overdo the whole eugenics thing, and the Jews reacted against that because they were the ones who were going to be eugenicized, and they came to the US with the Frankfurt School as an effort to war against our continued use of Darwin. And so what you see from Marx, Freud, Bose, etc., is an attempt to feminize science into a monopoly again in the female model. And you saw Europeans get to eugenics, which was a continuation of the male model. Then you saw the war, where the Jews had created Marxism and then created the thing we call the Soviet Union. And we saw what happened there because the female method doesn't work.
What's interesting about that, the Soviet system, it's like the feminist system is capable of generating a state beyond which its intuition fails to organize an economy for.
Correct. Because they have to be in control. Look at how mothers treat their children and how difficult it is for mothers to let their children go. They're trying to maintain control. This is their instinct. And they're trying to maintain control by empathic means. They're not trying to maintain it by incentives, rational, reciprocal incentives. They're trying to maintain it by seduction, gossiping, shaming, and rallying. What does your mother do? She makes you feel guilty. So what do women do when they scale? The same fucking thing. In any event, so what's happening is this repetition. But what is the technique they use? How do they do it? Well, once you put it into words, it's really easy. And I usually call it seduction, baiting into hazard by false promise, or false promise, baiting into hazard. And so if I'm enticing you into a game of dice where I'm guaranteed to win, I'm promising you an irreciprocal return that I can't warranty. What's a woman doing by keeping all those men in her sphere, in her orbit? Same fucking thing. So there are 4 dimensions of false promise. Defeating logic, the formal laws. In other words, they're trying to use seduction or disapproval to make you avoid using logic. In other words, feels over reals. This is one of their weapons. They evade reason at all costs because reason requires reciprocity, and they're always trying to rent seek, not get reciprocity. So what you see is magical thinking, utopian thinking, whatever. The second thing is freedom from physical laws, scarcity. They externalize the laws of the universe onto men because what they're doing is generating demand. When they know that's what they're doing, that's one thing. When they think men are creating the laws of nature, then they become a problem. Well, that's what they're doing. They create false promise of freedom from natural laws. In other words, the rational incentives of all parties. So they engage again in magical thinking. And the false promise of evolutionary laws, which is the male's problem. The male's trying to preserve the tribe. What you're seeing in Europeans is we're trying to preserve our civilization because it's our group reproductive strategy. It's our competitive advantage. Women's competitive advantage is just how attractive are they, who can they fuck into giving them something. They industrialize the sale and distribution of these false promise by a set of 5 tactics. Faith healing, delaying into hazard. So this is when your mother tells you it's going to be fine. Whenever Brett Weinstein or Sam Harris or any of them, what they're doing is using faith healing. It's delaying into hazard. It's preventing you from stopping a harm. They use false storytelling. This is the one I noticed. I can't listen to any of these guys anymore because the minute they go into narrative, what they're trying to do is bait you into empathy, loading, framing, obscuring, suggestion, and suspension of disbelief. In other words, by telling a story, they're baiting you into suspension of disbelief where you don't audit. And the way they do that is they pretend they're making a moral argument, just like a woman pretends she's making a romantic argument. They make the false promise, and they advance the false promise by not speaking testimonially. So not only do they tell stories, but they include sophistry to idealism, magic to pseudoscience, occult to theology, or evasion to denial. Then they use critique, which is false criticism, which is they undermine you, any opposition you have. And they do it by undermining you and your motives, not the argument. They never produce an equally competitive argument. They never propose a solution that's equally viable because that would open it to reason and criticism. Instead, they focus all of these things on preventing you from getting at the truth. Then they use duplicitous, double standard, irreciprocal, polylogical ethics, which I usually express as special pleading. They take the position that despite every lie they've just gone through and every factor of lying they've just demonstrated, that they're virtuous. And then they escalate. So they escalate from the least burdensome to the most burdensome tactic. They start out with faith healing. In other words, trying to blow it off or soothe you out of it. Have you ever been in a fight with a woman, they try to get next to you, touch you?
Okay.
They'll do it, especially really feminine women. If I could just touch him or get close to him, it's really beautiful. I mean, if you can get one of those lusciously wonderful feminine,
right?
They're just yum. They're one. I mean, you don't care that you're being manipulated because of the luxury of it. They want to touch you. Why? Because it releases hormones that'll bias your decision, and they know it. So they start out with this faith healing, and then they sell a false promise, like, "Well, I'll do this for you, or this will be all fine, or whatever." They sell a false promise. And if they can't do that, they evade or silence you, which is shaming, moralizing, psychologizing. I love this. Is like their first reaction isn't that's true or not. It's you're a bad person. The minute you see that, you know, okay, it's a feminine brain. I can't talk to you. You're not an adult. Next is they undermine you. They try to soothe you. If they can't, they make a false promise to you, which is they bribe you. If they can't, they evade you. If they can't get over that, they undermine you. And if they can't get that, they attack you, which deplatforming, conspiracy, whatever. And when they get caught, they hide behind plausible deniability that it was freedom of choice and they were doing the right thing. But it's just a different kind of criminal behavior.
It points back to the gypsies again.
The gypsies aren't annoying enough to get rid of, right? Women aren't annoying enough to smack around, right? I mean, it just aren't most of the time. And that's just how it is. They use delay, deceive, undermining, sowing discord, and they destroy the genetic, normative, cultural, institutional capital by use of disinformation, deceit, defamation, sedition, and treason. Then they do that by baiting into hazard by the false promise of freedom from constraints of the formal, physical, natural, evolutionary laws. Then they use their technique, which is sophistry, called pilpul, undermining, which is called critique, escaping from liability and warranty, which is their special pleading, by pretense of plausible deniability, that it was your choice and they didn't mean anything. Despite the deliberate avoidance of their due diligence, in other words, they intentionally avoided use of reason to self-criticize and audit, and the deliberate evasion of warranty, deliberate escape from liability, given the asymmetry of knowledge and the dependence upon instincts, the presence of malincentives of both the agents and victims, and it's pursued for the purpose of attention, reward, profit, influence, power, undermining power, and the trust and cooperation of a population in a normal distribution, thereby generating recursive, accelerating cycles of internal conflict, generating demand for authority to control by these women and their advocates. In other words, they're undermining order in order to replace it with a different order.
It's the way the Soviet thing came into being.
We shouldn't be surprised that someone on this earth would specialize in the female method of warfare. Seduction by false promise on one end and undermining and reputation destruction on the other. They've just institutionalized this into seducing people into the great hazard of leftism and female authoritarian monopoly rule by man, in other words, the left, versus male anti-authoritarian rule of law on the right. And this crap has taken root as a catastrophe across our civilization. And it went from Rousseau to Hegel to Marx to the neo-Marxists to the postmodernists to the PC woke. And the vehicle by which that was done was the people most able and professionalized and institutionalizing the female method of warfare, which is the at worst, they said what they were going to do, and they did it. And they've been kicked out of 100 countries already for doing it. It's not like they don't know that. They don't know it, but they won't revise their history. They act like Judaism was invented in 1600. They're ignoring everything that happened before that. And they're doing that because, of course, they couldn't face it the same way women can't self-correct, because it requires self-auditing. And we gave them an army, which was women liberated by us without regulating the female method of antisocial behavior and the female method of warfare. Now, realize, if you've ever been into a group of women and they always stick together against the men no matter what, right? Always. They're not afraid of even coming out against their husband because loyalty binds that, but they'll always stick together. So where do you think preservation of separatism comes from? The diasporic people preserve their culture of separatism. They demonstrate intolerance and non-integration. In other words, no matter what you do, they won't integrate. Women are the same. They'll stay favoring the women. They'll evade all payments for costs of the commons. They'll try to free ride on the cost of the commons. The commons are males' responsibility. They evade production or productivity. In other words, they avoid the things that are physically costly, just as our women push men out of the easy jobs into the hard jobs. And then they want to worry about equal pay. The practice this same strategy as a diasporic people, which is the female method of avoiding work that puts them at risk and maximizing their potential to free ride. They prefer parasitism, profiting from baiting into hazard, usually alcohol, prostitution, slave trading, gambling, organized crime. Usury is in there. It's just, our financial system is just usury at an abstract scale. They specialize in the use of the state against the people, the say women specialize in the use of men against men. They invest their assets from these criminal activities into additional rent seeking. In other words, how women divorce you and take advantage of your child support and alimony. They undermine moral and ethical markets and trades, slowly migrating capital into mixed criminal black market, gray market, and open market industries. We see this as their allocation of capital to undermining the legal system, the academic system, and the political system, and our mythological system in the entertainment business, and undermining our information system in the media. They produce disinformation by producing alternate histories or propaganda, which is what women do. They tell stories, fictionalisms. And they undermine the state, their knowledge, their traditions, their culture, and institutions, norms in order to convert the state from a suppression of locals at rents to the maximization of rents that they can extract, which is what women do from men. So when I say it's just instinct, they don't have to have a plan.
That's right.
They don't need one. They're just doing what comes naturally, which is the female method of undermine. They've just weaponized it because we haven't prohibited them from weaponizing.